For nearly 1,000 years, the fate of the Jedi Order rested on one individual. Yoda was not simply a teacher or a sage. As Grand Master of the Jedi, he carried responsibility for the training of generations, the preservation of Jedi knowledge, and the survival of the Order itself through centuries of instability. Every major decision the Jedi made during the final centuries of the Republic passed in some form through Yoda. And when the Jedi Order was finally destroyed, when their temple fell, and the archives burned, the galaxy turned against its protectors. It was Yoda alone who remained as the living continuity of the institution. With the Order gone, the burden of the Jedi did not vanish, but it passed to a new successor, Luke Skywalker. Luke was not merely one of Yoda's students. He became the next bearer of that great responsibility, the one charged with deciding whether the Jedi would be reborn at all, and if so, what kind of order would rise from the ashes. Through Luke, the legacy of the Jedi Grand Master continues, not as a council or a bureaucracy, but as a single line of custody stretching across generations. But this line did not begin with Yoda, and when we trace it backwards, past the Council, past the height of the Republic, past centuries of accumulated tradition, it does not lead to a grand institution or a famous lineage. It leads to a name preserved only in fragments: N'Kata Del Gormo. Delgormo was a Jedi Master who had lived in a very different era, one shaped by the closing chapters of the new Sith Wars, when the Jedi Order had spent nearly 1,000 years locked in open conflict with the Sith. By the time Delgormo appears in legend, the war has ended, the Sith were believed extinct, and the Jedi were attempting to redefine their entire role in the galaxy that they had just barely managed to save. Unlike later Grand Masters, Delgormo does not appear as a leader of the Order though. He doesn't command armies, or sit at the center of a council. He doesn't even leave behind a lineage. If records of his service ever existed, they were likely lost in the Jedi archives when they were destroyed during Order 66, along with countless figures who operated on the fringes of the Jedi Order. What we do know is that Delgormo was recognized as a Jedi Master that had knowledge of a wider order, and that he encountered Yoda at the very beginning of his long path, not to induct Yoda into power, but to direct him towards something greater. Delgormo did not keep Yoda in isolation. He didn't attempt to create a rival tradition. He simply sent Yoda onward to Coruscant, to the Jedi, and ultimately towards the responsibilities that would define his life and large portions of the galaxy. Whatever Delgormo's own path became after that, his role in Jedi history was not to rule the Order, but set the first link in the chain of those that would. From Delgormo, to Yoda, to Luke. Unfortunately, when it comes to N'Kata Del Gormo, we do not have the luxury of complete records. We do not know the exact length of his life. We don't know every world that he walked. We do not know the full extent of his service to the Jedi. And that absence is deeply unusual. If Delgormo's name was never fully cataloged in the archives, and the records were almost certainly destroyed, many figures who stood outside of the temple's central hierarchy, the Wanderers, Observers, the unorthodox maverick Jedi, were very easy to lose. In universe, the legend of N'Kata Del Gormo exists only as his role as Yoda's Jedi Master. His existence has not been confirmed, but according to official Lucasfilm representatives, the character of N'Kata Del Gormo was real. So what was he actually like? Well, although we don't have specifics, what we can do is reconstruct the type of Jedi that Delgormo was by examining the galaxy that shaped him. Because he lived in the shadow of one of the most violent and destabilizing eras in the entire galactic history, the new Sith Wars. For nearly 1,000 years, the Sith of this era were not a unified force. They were fragmented, cobbled together, and dangerously unstable. These were not the refined Sith of later centuries or the structured empires of the earlier golden eras. They were desperate. The new Sith Wars once began with Darth Ruusan, formerly the Jedi Master known as Martynas, whose fall marked the rebirth of the Sith after a millennium of dormancy. Darth Ruusan was a horrific Dark Lord who would usher in this new war. Ruusan didn't simply turn to the dark side, but he embraced a philosophy of absolute solipsism. He believed that only he truly existed, and that all other beings were extensions of his will. His reign ended not through Jedi justice, but with his own followers turning on him, stabbing him in the back, unable to exist within the reality that he imposed. This dangerous pattern repeated itself again and again in this time. Sith Lords rose not as careful architects of long-term power and planning, but as ideological tyrants, each wielding fragments of knowledge and incomplete philosophies. One of the more horrific examples is Belia Darzu, whose experiments with techno-beasts and dark science blurred the line between alchemy and monstrosity. Her creations reflect the state of the Sith of this era: ravenous, terrifying precisely because they lack restraint. These Sith were not weaker for their instability, but they were more dangerous. Unlike the unified Sith empires of earlier eras, such as Naga Sadow during the Great Hyperspace War, or the disciplined Sith empire of Malgus and Vitiate, the Sith of the new Sith Wars were fighting each other as often as they ever fought Jedi. They ruled through terror and obsession, belief rather than structure. Regions of space were devastated not through strategy, but through fanaticism. The Republic nearly collapsed multiple times not because the Sith were coordinated, but because they were unpredictable and seemingly everywhere. This was the Sith Order that Delgormo's generation faced, and the Jedi were not untouched by the chaos. Over the centuries, the Jedi Order fractured internally. Jedi became generals, governors, and even hereditary lords of entire systems of space. Figures like Lord Hoth, individuals that commanded massive armies and wielded extraordinary political authority. Children were inducted into warfare. The Force itself was increasingly treated as a weapon of mass destruction. When the war finally ended on Ruusan, the Jedi emerged victorious, but deeply scarred and forever changed. Grand Master Fae Coven presided over the past war reset, stripping the Order of much of its overt militarism and attempting to reframe the Jedi as peacekeepers yet again, rather than rulers. It was an era of reinvention, and it is within this exact moment that N'Kata Del Gormo makes the most sense. We do not know the lifespan of the Hysalrian species. There are no canonical records establishing how long they live. However, it has been speculated in the fandom that Del Gormo could have lived for centuries, meaning that at the very least, he was alive during the new Sith Wars, and perhaps was even a veteran of them. If this is true, then Del Gormo's rejection of war, of the Jedi structure, and even the lightsaber become more than aesthetics. It becomes a pure reaction to the war. Delgormo sought something more fundamental than restructure. He abandoned the tools of war and carried a Force-imbued staff. He traveled to planets rich in the Force, studying how it moved naturally, through ecosystems, through decay and renewal. Because for nearly 1,000 years, the Force had rarely been allowed to exist in this form at all. During the war, it was drawn again and again into acts of annihilation. Sith used it to tear apart and shatter armies, to collapse worlds, and impose their will on the galaxy. The Force became something pulled hard and fast, consumed in bursts of rage, obsession, and certainty. The Jedi, fighting for survival, were drawn into this same current. They used the Force to halt invasions, to crush strongholds, to hold together a republic that was fracturing. Over time, the Force ceased to be something lived alongside, and it became something to be deployed. The galaxy began to show the strain. Civilizations fell. Trade routes collapsed. Entire systems reduced to ruin. The rhythm of life across the galaxy was interrupted again and again. Worlds were devastated faster than they could recover. For a Jedi sensitive to the Force, this felt deeply wrong, unhealthy, as though the Force itself had been pushed out of balance by violence itself. By the time the war finally concluded, what remained was not a triumph, but exhaustion. And it was here, in the aftermath of this exhaustion, that Delgormo's choice is clear. He turned away from battlefields and councils, and instead sought a place where the Force still moved freely, where death fed new growth, instead of simple conquest, where decay was not an ending, but was a part of the natural cycle. He wanted to see life return to itself, to feel the Force in soil, in water, in growth, in rot, in the quiet persistence of living systems healing. In a galaxy undone by 1,000-year war, Delgormo chose to reconnect with the Force not as a weapon, but as life. In doing so, he echoed the ancient philosophies of Tython, when the Force was studied as balance before it was ever codified into ranks or rules. It is in this state, this stripped-down, elemental understanding of the Force, that Delgormo would teach Yoda. Their time together was brief, we know that for sure. Yoda was not raised in exile. Delgormo sent him onward, directing him to Coruscant and to the wider Jedi. Yoda even had a companion who crash-landed with him on the Swamp World. And the Swamp World is also important to the lore. Many once believed the world to be Dagobah. However, Li Lin-Chi has confirmed that Dagobah was not this location. Some have speculated that the world may have been Hysalria, the Hysalrian homeworld, which is also swamp-like, and located relatively close to Dagobah on galactic maps. Others argue it was simply a world rich in the Force, a place where Delgormo could study. The truth is, we don't know. What matters is that Delgormo was there by choice, and according to all surviving legends, and according to Yoda himself, this was his first true Jedi Master. not because of the time he spent, but because of the depth of what he learned. Yoda's training with Delgormo may have lasted only months, but Star Wars has always told us that time is not the measure of mastery. Luke himself only trained with Yoda for a few weeks at the most. What matters is a moment, the teacher, and the state of the Force. And finally, the pattern completes itself. In the novelization for Revenge of the Sith, Yoda openly acknowledges Qui-Gon Jinn as his Jedi Master, becoming his apprentice even after his death. Yoda apologizes for not listening, for not recognizing the truth of Anakin, the Sith, and about the living Force. Like Delgormo, Qui-Gon was unorthodox, a maverick, a Jedi who trusted the Force before any structure. Together, Delgormo and Qui-Gon Jinn reveal something important about Yoda's story. Even the greatest Grand Masters still have lessons to learn, and often it is the outsiders, the wanderers, the listeners, who shape the most important lineages in all of Jedi history, from Delgormo to Yoda to Luke Skywalker. This is where the story of N'Kata Del Gormo becomes more than a legend, because despite how little survives about him, his influence is hiding in plain sight every time Yoda speaks. According to Frank Oz, the voice and performance behind Yoda, Yoda's unusual manner of speech was never meant to reflect his species. Oz would later tell Dave Filoni that he believed that Yoda spoke that way as a form of respect, an echo of how his master once spoke, a way to honor and remember his first teacher. Yoda reinforces this. When he rarely speaks of his time as a student, he doesn't speak of combat or dominance. He speaks of peace of mind, about learning to find calm within oneself, guiding others towards that same peace. He makes it clear that this above all is more valuable than becoming great through war or powerful through conflict. And this tells us something very important about Yoda's own master. If this was the Jedi who shaped Yoda at the beginning of his journey, then Delgormo was likely not weak or withdrawn. He was probably immensely powerful, not because he sought power, but just like Yoda, because he did not. Because he chose to commune with the Force rather than seek to command it. Because N'Kata Del Gormo understood that restraint, a balance, and a respect for life were not limitations. They were deep forms of strength. In a galaxy scarred by 1,000 years of war, Delgormo did not try to rebuild empires or to reform institutions. He chose something simpler: to listen, to absorb, to run his fingertips through blades of grass. He chose something simpler and far more difficult to master: to listen and observe, to live with the Force as it was meant to exist. So now I'll leave it to you. What do you think N'Kata Del Gormo truly represented? Was he a forgotten Jedi Master, a deliberate outsider, or the last echo of an ancient Jedi tradition that the Order had nearly lost? Let me know your thoughts, and if you would like to explore more lost figures like Yoda's master, you know where to find me. It's been an honor to have you in the archives here today, and as always, may the Force be with you.